观众朋友们好，感谢您来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。在上期的思想先驱报中啊，我们特别为大家介绍了华为，特别是讲到了任正非的这一种忧患意识啊，比如给自己这个突围办公室起名叫做2012办公室，所引用的是著名灾难片的名字。而同时啊，在习近平提出所谓的灰犀牛和黑天鹅论之前的几年，华为已经在准备黑天鹅了，不仅仅是准备黑天鹅，还在养黑天鹅。那么此前呢，我们引述西方媒体的报道，讲到华为的深圳校区里面还真的有黑天鹅。那么在我们播出了这期节目之后啊，我们很快有神通广大的观众朋友们还真的是去华为的深圳校区亲自去检验，发现呢还真的是有黑天鹅，就像我们在屏幕上所展示的一样。感谢这位网友为我们节目所提供的精彩素材。今天思想先驱报我们仍然要讨论的是华为的问题，不仅仅要讨论华为的问题，还要讨论中芯，更广泛的而言，讨论整个中国半导体生态产业链可能在眼皮底下正在发生的巨大的变化。今天我们着重为大家推荐的是彭博社的商业播客节目 Outlots 最新的一期节目。那我们说有关于芯片这个问题复杂就复杂在行外人只能看个热闹，行内人才知道水平高还是水平真的低。因此分析华为的经济实力，分析整个中国芯片产业的实力，我们还真得听专家的意见，光看新闻报道显然是不够的。那为什么要推荐来自彭博社的这一期播客节目呢？就是他们特别找到了现在顶级的半导体产业分析专家，其中有一位就是之前对于华为进行拆机处理的这一个智库公司的负责人。两位不仅仅对于半导体整个产业可以说是如数家珍，对于中国半导体的政策和发展也了解得十分透析。因此在周五我听完了这个播客节目之后很快就跟何斌先生说，我们一定要在思想先驱报把这样的好节目介绍给我们的观众朋友们。那我们也知道，华为在业内人士看来，之前一直是技术领域的领导者，不管是在 5G 领域还是在其他领域。几年前，他们遭到了美国和西方半导体供应链多方面的禁令。当时，其实很多半导体业内人士都认为，华为这一下恐怕是要少掉半壁江山。当时对于华为最明显的影响是，他们没有办法再利用全球最大芯片制造商台积电的服务了。但是就在几周之前，华为突然推出了一款可以搭载自家芯片的 5G 手机。那么根据接受彭博社播客节目采访的这两位专家说实际上在华为刚刚宣布自己有了 5G 手机的时候，业内的初始预期并不高，认为呢这可能只是某一种政治意涵的表态。但是当这一些专家真正体验了这一款手机之后，他们用了一个词叫做大吃一惊，没有想到这一款手机的性能如此的出色。到底出色到什么程度呢？用这个接受采访的一位专家的话说，和三星使用高通芯片的这种手机相比在这个手机的芯片的专业性能方面，其实只差1年半左右了这呢是远远超过了之前大家对于华为破局的进度的预期，甚至在于某些方面来说，已经和苹果和三星的手机相媲美，甚至比苹果和三星的手机还要好。那我们在说手机性能的时候，大家可能会问，到底什么叫做手机性能？手机与手机之间哪个好哪个坏，到底怎么比？这个时候这个嘉宾专家就解释到首先是网络性能，手机能够下载和上传数据的速度到底有多快？结果他们对于华为的这一款手机进行测速了之后，发现不仅仅是和外国顶级手机相当，甚至比 iPhone 最新款的手机速度还要快，比基于高通芯片的手机可以相媲美。另外就是手机的 CPU、GPU 和人工智能方面，这一方面呢，华为是不仅仅使用了中国国内的制造能力，也使用了中国国内的芯片设计能力，基本上已经赶齐了1年前甚至更近期的外国的产品，这也是让他们觉得十分惊讶的。而从其他的软性性能上看不管是手机游戏视频，还是在相机的清晰度方面，可以说用这些嘉宾的话说，手机的每一个方面都堪称一流。 那我们说华为这样一家中国企业做出一个世界一流的手机，表面上看上去也不算什么大事。但是嘉宾说，真正让他们震惊的是，华为是在没有极紫外光刻机的情况下所做成的这一切。用嘉宾的话说，就好像是华为的双手被捆在身后，做出了一款手机一样。那么这个中芯啊，现在也取得了技术的进益，被外界认为，其实华为这一款手机是与中芯相配合所达成的这样的进步。据两位嘉宾介绍，现在其实中芯基本上已经接近与台积电相媲美的工艺，甚至可能超过了英特尔。中芯可以做出7纳米的芯片，英特尔差不多也是7纳米的芯片，台积电当然可以做得更好，但是这显然已经达到了国际一流，甚至是一流半这样的一个水准。这一点啊，在嘉宾看来也是十分了不起的一个突破。有的时候我们在提及中国的科技发展的时候啊，就连很多在中国长期工作的科学家谈到中国的这样的一个研究氛围啊，也会觉得离西方差得太远。但是我们这里特别要说啊，尽管从整个的学术环境还有科研的水准来看，中国现在离美国的确差距非常大啊，不只是一代人的差距。但是中国在商业创新和制造工艺创新上的速度，往往又是被外界所忽视的。当时啊，主持人也觉得十分惊讶，没有想到中芯现在已经达到了实力和英特尔可以媲美的程度。那么当时啊，主持人就问了嘉宾一个问题，说他到底这个7纳米的芯片是怎么样生产出来的？到底是依靠怎样的资源生产出来的？而嘉宾解释说，中芯啊，在没有 EUV， 就是现在阿斯麦能够生产的极紫外光刻机的情况下，他们采取的是另外一种相当复杂的工艺技术，叫做4重光刻技术。4重光刻技术帮助中芯解决了现在在不具备 EUV 的情况下推出7纳米芯片的技术关卡。即使是英特尔这样技术实力雄厚的公司，在生产7纳米芯片的时候也是遭遇了瓶颈，而当时英特尔没有在4重光刻技术方面取得突破。所以从这个意义上来讲，中芯在这样具有明显制约的环境下取得了技术突破，实在呀，不仅仅是对于中芯本身啊，我们叫做生产能力的一个重要的加分项，也是对于中芯创新能力的重要的加分项。因为4重光刻实际上是相当复杂的一种技术。当然，嘉宾也提到，美国对于中国进行的出口管制本身也有诸多的问题，执行非常的不严格，导致其中有很多的落后以及滞后。这些漏洞啊，你造成一个漏洞，很快就可以被利用上，而补这个漏洞往往是一个漫长的政治和司法过程。这客观上来讲，也是帮助了中芯和华为能够迅速突破。比如啊，像中芯这样的企业，它往往是有多条生产线，有领先的生产线，也有比较滞后的生产线。领先的生产线可能是生产14纳米的，那滞后的生产线可能是90纳米或者是28纳米的。但是啊，对于中芯来说，有2家不同的子公司，设备是可以自由的进行转移的。因此啊，有一些情况似乎表明，对于美国的半导体限制，每一次限制出台之后啊，公司都利用这样的漏洞，在不同的子公司和生产线之间啊进行转移，可以说客观上延缓了美国的出口管制对于中国的影响。尽管这一些漏洞慢慢被找到，并且被补上了。还有呢，就是我们所说的第三国问题，这个呀，在出口管制上一直是执行上的一个重大的问题。嘉宾也特别提到，应用材料公司在韩国的工厂啊进行相关的生产，再通过韩国的第三方工厂转移到中国。那么中芯国际啊，一方面是我们刚才说的领先的生产线和滞后的生产线，有一些设备虽然是受到了限制，但是我们可以在中芯内部这个系统中把设备转移到领先的生产线上，还有呢，通过第三方工厂等等等等，帮助中芯在早期啊，在应对美国的出口管制的时候有这样的一个缓冲的空间。当然了，美国现在的半导体仍然是独步天下啊，在很多技术层面上领先中国非常的多。但是在嘉宾看来，美国的半导体产业现状，我们说的不是技术现状，而是产业现状，离中国相比，不仅仅是落后，而且嘉宾用词叫做非常滞后。此话怎么讲呢？美国现在虽然是推出了所谓的芯片法案，但是在嘉宾看来，整个的这个资金规模呀，实在是太小了。而中国推动大量补贴啊，进行半导体产业的突围，虽然有很多的浪费，但是啊， 这我们叫做这个，说句难听的英文里的谚语啊，烂泥巴往墙上扔，总归能糊上一块儿。这样的发展速度还是远远超过了西方的预期，也超过了半导体产业内部对于中国发展的预期。那么，为什么美国对于中国的这种堵塞和制裁没有起到应有的效果呢？用嘉宾的话说，这就是因为呀，美国实际上在关于对中国的芯片我们叫做封锁上说的和做的实际上是两种完全不一样的。那我们说，美国不希望完全在中国禁止跟芯片相关的一切领域，为什么？比如说一些这个90纳米的芯片、28纳米的芯片，在汽车呀，在一些洗衣机呀，在一些家庭家电中仍然有非常重要的作用。那么，如果中国不能生产这一些组件，对于美国自己的消费也是巨大的影响。美国希望能够堵住中国生产领先的设备，但是在半导体这个领域有一个什么特点呢？就是没有说一个芯片是专供某一个行业所使用的，各个工艺之间往往是相通的。那么28纳米的芯片能够解决的问题，7纳米有的时候能够解决，7纳米能够解决的问题，28纳米经过改进和技术的加工也能够解决。因此并不是说你封锁了14纳米，中国就不可能从28纳米进步到14纳米。这个中间的我们叫做灵活性和工艺层面的转化率，远远超出美国立法者的想象。那么之前我们也特别谈到，华为使用堆叠呀，还有精密包装等等方式，实际上是绕过了纳米层级本身对于华为所形成的障碍，相当于是用更低级的、更低效的方法达成了一样的效果。这一点完全是工艺上的创新和进步，而不是我们说纯属科技意义上的进步和创意。而这一点往往是美国制造者和美国的这个我们叫做立法者或者是政策制定专家所忽视的一点。那么现在在这个整个的这个对话中主持人和嘉宾呢一起还探讨到了中国在其他方面领域的进益，比如说在汽车芯片等等等等。这时嘉宾就提到了一个非常重要的一个问题，就是说中国往往形成一个产业的时候，它是一个垂直性的产业。比如说我们说比亚迪自己有自己的芯片晶圆加工厂，比亚迪自己有自己的电池供应商，比亚迪甚至自己有自己的船队，它的整个的这个模型是一个垂直性的一个模型，就导致它在每一个环节上都可以把成本压得最低。如果比亚迪只在某一个生产环节上有所技艺，尽管是掌握了世界上最先进的技术，但是你毕竟要仰赖其他人对你的供给。比如说英伟达这家企业为什么被认为是一家非常成功的企业呢？与它整个供应链的布局有很大的关系。嘉宾就特别谈到，英伟达也是在整个垂直的产业布局上进行了多方多元的准备，让英伟达在每一个环节的溢价上都有绝对的主导权，让英伟达的成本可以压得非常的低。那比如说对于中国的这一些芯片产业而言，他们往往借鉴的是当时三星或者是台积电的发展模式。当时主持人提出了一个问题，说近期我们看到中芯国际的报表发现它的利润率减少了80%，因此很多质疑者就说你这个中芯，你是不是完全就是靠补贴活下来的一个企业？哪天中国不给你灌水，不给你输血，你这个企业是不是很快就完蛋了？你是不是采取的这个工艺技术是非常低效的工艺技术，导致你的造价成本如此之高，又达不成量产的目标？对于这一点，嘉宾也提出了业内人士的专业看法。他就说实际上中芯所走的这一条路并不是例外之路。如果我们看到台积电早期的发展轨迹，看到三星早期的发展轨迹，知道他们在整个行业成立之初都是受到国家级的援助，都是受到产业补贴，而且呢在最开始的时候都是长期亏损的。那么台积电也好，像我们提到的中芯也好，他们未来的盈利潜力在哪里呢？这里就涉及到一个产业格局的问题。一家美国企业，不管是英特尔还好，也是美光还好， 好，他们往往有一个特点，就是关注最先进的技术。我要突围的是7纳米，我要突围的是5纳米或者是4纳米，我就专注于顶尖的技术。但是我们知道，整个芯片市场有85%的利润来源，其实并不是一般意义上的顶尖芯片，可能是28纳米甚至是90纳米的芯片。这里就涉及到一个工艺的问题，美光也好，还是我们说的英特尔也好，他们很少去改进旧芯片的动力。但是据嘉宾介绍，在台积电也好，在这个德克萨斯机械制造也好，他们有一个特点，整个产品的这个序列是几千种不同的产品，很老旧的产品，比如90纳米的芯片或者是28纳米的芯片，他们还在进行工艺上的不断改进。这个芯片工艺到底是怎么提高的呢？用嘉宾的话说，并不是某一种突破性的科学创造，就像你在校对一个安全保险箱一样，可能就是左移一下啊，右移一下，很小这样的一个移动和校动，看一看啊，这个左移右移是不是改变性能了呀？进行无数次这样的实践中的校对，最后呢是达成整个性能的提升。而不管是台积电也好，还是德州的这个仪器制造厂也好，他们呢往往是在旧的芯片上进行了新的工艺的创新，降低了成本，为他们带来了更大的利润空间。而中芯也是，尽管现在7纳米对于中芯而言很难形成有利可图的市场前景，但是中芯制造的不仅仅是7纳米的芯片，在其他我们叫做更基础性的芯片领域，中芯可以不断改进工艺，而在改进旧领域的工艺的时候，又助力在新的更前沿的芯片领域的不断的进击啊。这呢是嘉宾提出的一个重要的看法。不管是德州仪器也好，还是台积电也好，还是现在的中芯也好，他们呢在改进旧工艺，还有形成整个产品的路线图这一方面是下了非常深的功夫。比如嘉宾就特别举到德州仪器这一家公司，已经是一家非常成熟的公司了，他们的成熟的半导体芯片往往毛利率可以达到65%甚至70%，而在最顶尖的这一部分，往往利润率却没有那么高。谈到中国的新兴的企业，现在其实大家最兴奋的点还不是在7纳米、5纳米，而是在所谓的微控制器单元，叫做 MCU。这些受访的嘉宾特别讨论了 MCU 对于中国工业发展的重要性，可能并不是最先进的人工智能芯片，但是在商业上是有重要的用途和前景，市值达到数十亿美元。美国对于中国的限制可能在最前沿的这一方面有所动作，但是从商业和经济工业的角度来看，中国企业把重心放在了并不是在绝对前沿的领域，而是真正实用的这一些领域，并且投入了大量的资金。这是中国产业政策的另外一块，也是经常被我们所忽视的。我们往往想到的中国讲的是弯道超车，讲的是卡脖子这一方面，实际上中国在整个制造业中也在改善没有被卡脖子，但是对于中国未来制造和商业发展非常重要的这一部分那么这呢也是嘉宾在这一次对话中所提供的一个重要的思路。另外嘉宾在谈到中国的半导体生产产业格局文化和美国的产业格局文化的时候，特别提到了人才问题。现在不管是在中国、韩国还是台湾，微电子还有芯片领域的人才，特别是高级蓝领制造人才成为了非常火的就业专业，但是在美国，似乎大家对于蓝领的就业仍然是缺乏兴趣。最聪明的人仍然更多的是选取白领或者是金融领域的这一些工作。那么这个嘉宾还特别提及到说，现在在很多中国以及亚洲的产销会上，最流行的那一些公司的产态往往招聘的是制造工人，当然不是简简单单的初级制造工人，而是高级具有工艺含量的制造工人。我也特别注意到，今天早上《纽约时报》专门有一篇文章讲到中国现在非常短缺的就是高级的蓝领制造人才，其中特别讲到了一位姓邢的，在上海附近的一位汽车工人。刚刚入这个汽车工人行业的时候在一家小汽车工厂工作，那么一年的年薪只有1000多美元，而他现在为比亚迪做这个整个的这个电动汽车的生产线上的一个生产工人，每年的年薪已经达到了6万美元这样的工资，这样的一个叫做专业工种，现在也是中国必须培育的。 同时，中国政府也在税收减免、在所谓的研发优惠上给予现在的芯片产业非常多的奖赏。比如这个受访者就特别谈及，现在只要你在中国进行芯片领域的研究，可能最开始5年你的企业都是免税的。如果你要进行尖端的特别重要的研究，可能10年都是免税的。如果你进行芯片设计，搞出一个芯片设计，不一定是顶尖的芯片设计，就可以直接获得100万的奖励。如果你在研发上有所投入，政府是200%的比例加成给你，也就是说你在研发上投入100块钱，政府直接再翻包200块钱给你，来帮助你在研发上继续投入。当然了，这样的一个政策是不是会导致扭曲的行为和欺诈呢？显然是的。那比如嘉宾也特别提及，现在很多中国企业不管你是做什么的，都成立一家半导体领域的分公司。结果呢，你把你其他公司所有部门的所有利润都转移到这一家半导体领域的子公司，所有这些利润5年之内都免税了。这呢，当然是走政策漏洞的一个重要的方式。还有这个文章中也特别提及，这也会导致很多浪费性的研究和浪费性的开发。比如有一家制造铁路车辆的公司叫做中国中铁，现在这一家公司提出了一个目标叫颠覆德国最大的芯片制造商英飞凌。为什么呢？因为我们知道这个铁路从一种能量转化成另外一种能量，其中涉及到芯片。本来中铁是从德国的英飞凌买这种芯片，结果现在国家要补贴芯片制造了，尽管这并不是卡脖子的技术，那么英飞凌对于中铁的供应也是相当稳定的。但是英飞凌为了吃这个中铁为了吃这个政策的红利，我们自己也要搞这一种芯片了，因此这更多的是一种浪费。但是嘉宾仍然认为，即使是有这么多的浪费，一点非常明确，就是中国现在在整个芯片技术上的投入，以及对于整个芯片产业创新的追求，已经远远超过了外界的想象。而中国的庞大的制造能力和企业的创新能力一旦被激发起来，中国的人才和活力优势和资本注入一旦被启动起来，在嘉宾看来，不仅仅可能取得全球半导体领域的领先地位，甚至在未来几年之内取得全球半导体领先地位，都并不是完全的痴人说梦那么这一篇文章，现在这个播客节目呢，我们今天是简单为大家梳理了主要内容。我们在今天节目结束之后呢，我们的导播也特别把这一期播客节目制作成了完整的视频，大家可以听一听现场的专家是怎么想的。那么下面我就要请问一下和平先生，这个播客节目的专家可以说提出了一些见解，是平时我们在中文媒体上很少看到的。对于中国的这一种制造活力和中国产业格局的复杂和创新实力，你是不是认同嘉宾在这一次播客节目中所提出的看法？
对，我非常认同就是我们讲到工业革命从17世纪从英国开始，为什么欧洲在很大程度上具有这个主导的力量？然后后来慢慢就转移到了美国，现在又在美国开始慢慢转移到中国。当然1战和2战对这个欧洲的伤害比较大，但是更重要的因素是当时候的美国的崛起，它具有人才的规模，它具有产业的规模，它甚至可以完成一个国家就可以完成一个生态的一个体系。然后战争成为了它巨大的这个推动力。那个时候的美国，你都可以到一个家庭妇女都可以放掉家庭的工作，到工厂去参加这个制造业。从欧洲各个地方的人才引向这个美国，劳动力也好，科技人才也好，创新也好，大学也好，有爱因斯坦这种伟大的科学家，对吧？有非常多的实质性的生活在这个制造业领域的这些工人、这些技术人、这些工程师，这就是美国崛起的真正的谜团。而这个谜团里面还有这个国家力量的驱动规模的效应和当时国际市场的这个需求。所以有人说美国就靠发战争财嘛，因为战争是一个巨大的驱动力。这也不像密西西比来一个农民说的，哎呀，我们已经是世界上最好的地方了，我们只要这里面包很大就可以了。不是，那个时候是美国展现了一个世界的雄心， 但是到了上个世纪60年代开始出现一个变化，这个变化就是美国的企业家开始发现，日本只有美国的薪水的5%，也就是同样的劳动力，日本人只要5%，而在台湾呢只要1%，这就是他们产生了一个想法，就是这个制造业不能老是停留在美国，成本太高，所以就开始往东南亚转移。这就是70年代、80年代所谓的亚洲几小龙或者是日本的迅速崛起的一个很重要的一个工业的驱动力，而不是大家现在政治意识形态化的是这个中共美国帮助了中国，然后中国利益这个东西发展搞了这个全球化。全球化不是冷战之后发生的，是在冷战之前冷战期间就已经开始驱动了。这种驱动是商业上的需求，那个时候的战争已经结束了，对吧？商家、企业家开始理性的思考这些问题，当理性思考节省这个经费，对吧？然后加上美国的产业的不断的调整和升级，传统的这个工人跟不上这个形势，而新的这些工人可以在东南亚找到，成本又低，就是开始慢慢让美国的制造业一步一步走向空心化。今天的美国仍然是具有世界上再多的人才、再顶级的研究工作，但是这些研究工作往往是在大学里面公司里面有一些吧，当然是有一些，但是你可以发现越来越倾向于这个往别的国家倾斜，尤其是中国和这个印度。为什么？因为中国和印度它是在实质性的这个底端，它是在生产这些东西，它直接面对的这个用户的需求能够立即反映到它的这个生产性本身。和美国这种联邦政府资助一个大学研究，这个研究出了一些成果，这些成果被某一个企业家发现，我可以利用这个东西。我记得几个月以前，李奇博士不是讲过，有一个人去找了麻省理工学院的一个教授吗？记得那个故事吗？对吧？这就是电池嘛，就是说美国的这个过程它非常的，它还有一个过程，而中国的过程直接就进入了市场，所以它的这个反应能力是非常快，有一点像类似于二战时候的科技发明。二战时候为什么有很多科技发明是那么迅速呢？尤其是英国，因为它有战争需求他马上就需要他根本不管成本不成本，我只要能够打倒这个敌人，我要赶紧制造出来就可以了。那中国现在在某种程度上，商业的竞争，国内商业的竞争也好，国家的给予的支持也好，国际市场反应也好，给了中国企业家的压力是远远超过美国企业家所承受的压力。美国的企业家还在享受在这个车库和地下室在创造和发明一个的时候，中国是在华强北怎么去模仿，怎么去剽窃，怎么去学习，而在更广泛的工业性上是怎么去改进，所以它的速度大的加快了。如果有一些事情在欧洲可能要10年，在美国可能只要8年或者5年，在中国可能就变成2年而且中国的这个规模它形成了一种自我完善的体系。什么叫自我完善的体系？就是说我们现在知道芯片为什么我认为是漏洞百出的，很难的，就是因为它涉及的国家太多，它形成这么一个链条，一个生产链是好几个国家的组成的，中国很有可能一个国家就可以。所以很多的思考我就非常感谢李杰博士。如果你没有去认真去听这些博客，你可能大家就漏掉了。如果是一篇英文文章，大家很多人还可以很快看到，一个博客你需要花时间，而且这么多的博客多数都是垃圾，在这个里面能够找到像这样的真正的见解是非常之少的。这也就是思想先驱报的观众应该感谢李杰博士，当然也感谢这些专家，他给我们打开了很多思路，很多思考的方式因为现在社交媒体对人们的误导性非常强，要么就是把中国讲得一清不知我一个朋友就讲，所有的东西都是偷了美国的， 这个人不是一般的人，他是在美国接受了很好的专业训练，他对中国情况也很了解，他就讲中国怎么贪污怎么腐败。我相信他讲的东西也不能说完全不是事实，可能相当多的是事实，但是在科研在生产制造过程中间，80%-90%浪费可能都是你不得不隐忍的事情，但是这方面只要10%或者5%是做成了，就是根本性的突破。
好，谢谢何明先生的介绍啊。当然，我们说有的时候啊，中国企业是做出了让外界所惊讶的成就；有的时候明明是非常成功的中国企业，在出海的时候也会遇到各种各样的问题。这到底又是什么样的原因呢？稍后另外一期《思想先驱报》节目中啊，我们就要讲这个故事的另外一面。为什么明明做得很优秀的中国企业，有的时候却做出让人失望的产品？稍后给大家留下一个悬念，下期我们再会。
谢谢。
I actually feel really behind on what's been happening in the industry. I've seen some headlines. I mean, obviously, we talked about NVIDIA earlier in the year, and that stock just exploded. And recently, they released their earnings. I've seen some news about additional export restrictions and things like that, but I haven't been paying close enough attention, and I feel really bad about that.
Do you ever read, Tracy, or have you ever tried?
Do I ever read? Yes, Joe.
You read? Have you ever tried to read those like really technical semiconductor publications that talk about, oh, the new NVIDIA chip has 4 different cores and a thing here? And have you ever seen those sites?
I have.
Sometimes people drop the links in our Discord, and I try to catch up to speed on what the hot new chip is, and I always give up 1/3 of the way through the post.
It's really difficult. I mean, even the ones where they talk about like wafer thinness and stuff like I can kind of understand it, but there's so much within this specific subject. There's sort of the big picture things like geopolitical tensions and trade tensions and things like that. And then you can really get into, I don't want to say the nuts and bolts of the specific technology, but you know, I don't know, the wafers and pins of specific technology.
So the one thing is, it seems like the lower nanometer number, the better.
Yes.
Right. But even there, and I know we've done some episodes in the past with Stacey Raskin, et cetera, even there, that only tells you so much about a chip's performance, and there are all different kinds of architectures and yields. We've talked about that too, or in theory, you could have a really powerful chip, but maybe it's not economical because you lose so many chips in the process, et cetera. So wrapping one's head around chips is tough.
Yes. Agreed.
But
what will we be doing on this episode? Trying to wrap our heads around chips.
Yeah. So, you know, there's been some news, particularly related to China. And I think Huawei came out with a phone fairly recently in the last couple months. And what caught people's attention was it seemed to have performance that people didn't assume it could have, given what was known about the state of domestic Chinese semiconductor capacity.
7 nanometers.
Yeah.
7 nanometers. I shouldn't whisper on a podcast. I don't know why I did that. It's not a secret. So supposedly it had a chip made by SMIC, a Chinese chip maker that was 7 nanometers, and something that people thought China wasn't able to produce just yet. And yet here we are talking about the 7 nm in these phones.
And I guess the question is this represent a major domestic breakthrough for China's semiconductor industry? Does it mean that some technology which wasn't supposed to get into the country somehow got in? So there's some sort of U.S. national security implications. But it's a good time. You know, we've talked about this for years, you know, with people like Dan Wong. Like, what is the state of Chinese semiconductor? Are they catching up? So I think it's a good time to take stock of the situation.
I agree. And also, you didn't mention the biggest thing that people are talking about now, which is the idea that have the restrictions basically created the exact opposite result intended and maybe accelerated China's semiconductor technology.
Which is something people have warned about, that ultimately, sure, maybe you set the country back a few years in its development, but if you restrict its capacity to get international technology, then it just builds faster its own homegrown. Anyway, all kinds of questions related to chips right now that we need to catch up on.
Yes. And also, can I just say that I blame the semiconductor restrictions on me having to read The 3 Body Problem. Oh. Did you ever read that? And now these visions, I don't know how many people have read it, but it's a lot of people used it as an analogy for China's technological development. But now I have nightmares about like little shriveled up dead people And if you've read the book, this makes sense.
Okay, well, let's talk chips. And we really do have two perfect guests, one of whom we've had on the show before, Doug O'Loughlin. He is the chief analyst at Fabricated Knowledge, a semiconductor research service, and Dylan Patel, chief analyst at SemiAnalysis, a boutique semiconductor and AI research firm. So we are going to pick their brains about the state of Chinese chips. So Doug and Dylan, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having me again.
Let's just start. What was it? What's the deal with this Huawei phone that caught everyone by surprise?
So Huawei has historically been a leader in technology. That wasn't a surprise to anyone.
Okay.
And a few years ago, of course, they got banned from, many aspects of the U.S. and Western semiconductor supply chain. They got banned from utilizing TSMC, the world's largest chip maker. And all of a sudden, they come out with their own phone, right? Their new phone that has their own chip made in China. The expectations, of course, when they first announced it were whatever. But then once people got their hands on the phone, it was like, oh my God, this is actually very good. When you compare to foreign phones, right, with say Qualcomm chips from like, say, Samsung, it is only, a year and a half behind, right? And in some respects, it's actually just as good. In certain specifications, depends on how nitty gritty you want to get into it. But at worst, 1.5 years behind, at best, on par, right? And so that was a big shocker for everyone.
Just real quickly on those specifications, like when you say the phone is really good, because I don't know, all phones sort of seem pretty good, and I don't really notice advances in phone. So when you say that the phone surprised people by its capacity, could you just be specific about what shocked people when they picked up this device?
Sure. So stage one is sort of the network performance, right? So it can download and upload data just as fast as any foreign phone, which is the sort of on par thing, right? In fact, it was better than the current iPhone. It was on par with the current Qualcomm-based phones. And so then that's like one specification. Another specification is your CPUs and GPUs and AI aspects of the phone, right? And there, they were not only using, they're, again, using domestic manufacturing capabilities. They were also using domestic design capabilities and were able to match, again, what folks had done a year and a half ago, or in some cases, even sooner, more recently, right? So this is sort of on a performance basis, whether it's in gaming, whether it's in, uploading and downloading videos, whether it's in camera, every aspect of this phone was on par, if you will.
I think that people just probably don't appreciate how impressive that is, given the fact that how little technology they have access to. So they did this without EUV, which was the big October restrictions in 2022. And I think the thing that's most impressive about this is like it's a really good chip with both hands tied behind their back. And I think that like if the restrictions weren't there, the implication is that SMIC could probably ship a leading edge phone as good as TSMC and maybe even better than Intel or domestic production. And I think that that's probably the biggest takeaway that I think people need to understand. And there's definitely some DUV tools that snuck in, and we can talk about the, all the mechanics of the cross, how slippery the restrictions have been and how maybe poorly enforced it's been. But like they did an amazing phone with both hands tied behind their back. And I think that in the conversation that we've been having about semiconductors in China for a long time, it's always been like, well, they're really far behind. They'll never catch up. And I think that this is the first time where you can say, like, if they had what we had, they've caught up. Like, I think that's, Dylan, do you agree or disagree with that?
I would say, if you compare just what's shipping in the market, yeah, of course, TSMC is shipping better, Samsung is shipped better, but, and everyone talks about this Intel turnaround that may or may not happen. Intel's best chips that they ship today are 7 nanometer, the same as what China has today, right? So it's on par. Now, of course, Intel's close to releasing their 4 nanometer, and you could caveat that in 100 ways. But if you look at what's in the market today, the densest, right? Again, you as you mentioned earlier, lower nanometer chip that you can buy today from an American manufacturer is from Intel, and the densest is from SMIC and Huawei, and it's the same, right? It's a similar capability.
Okay, so not since the invention of Pringles have people been so excited about a single chip. But you sort of alluded to this, Doug, but can you maybe walk us through what is needed to produce a 7nm and what, to your point about China basically doing this with a hand or two tied behind its back, what was actually available to them?
So this is a really hard question to answer. I'm gonna have to ask Dylan a lot about this as well. But the thing that I think probably differentiates it from, let's say, TSMC's process is that they did not have access to EUV. That's clearly the big delineation. But if you remember the original,
this is the extreme ultraviolet.
Yes, EUV extreme ultraviolet. That's the latest and greatest from ASML, and they cost like 300 million plus a pop. They're extremely advanced technology to make tiny wavelengths of light. But they managed to get around this with something called quad patterning, self-aligned quad patterning, which is like, we're not going to go into the details of that, extremely technical, but an extremely hard thing that Intel got caught up on. So they managed to ship the 7-nanometer chip much quicker than Intel managed to get through all of their problems doing the same quad patterning DUV process. And I think that that's a big deal. Like, it shows that there's a lot of technological oomph underneath the restrictions alone. And then on top of that, the restrictions have been extremely poorly enforced. That's why they had some restatements this year about specific entities. But what happens is, like, a good example is SMIC has a leading edge and a lagging edge factory, right? And they're both related entities. But my understanding is the lagging edge entity can go buy extremely advanced deposition and etch tools, ones that are on the restrictions for the October 2022, and then they can just kind of shuttle those tools into the fab of the leading edge and then effectively be able to use it.
That doesn't seem like it's doing, the restriction is doing what it was intended to do in that case.
Yeah, not at all. So far, pretty much what's happened, and this has happened every single time we've had restrictions on American semi-cap companies, is that the restrictions come out, all the companies say, oh, this is going to impact us. And then they slowly find ways for loopholes to be pushed through. An example is Applied Material had a South Korean factory that probably had, I think they are right now under investigation. And I think the thing is, it's pretty clear that some of the leading edge tools, ex the EUV stuff, is getting into China. And they're able to use clever engineering to make a better chip than we thought was possible.
Yeah, I would say that while in spirit, the regulations pretty much said, hey, you can't have less than 14 nanometers, the specifics of what was actually banned were quite a bit more varied, right? The tool that you can use for 28 nanometer, well, you just use many more of them for 7, right? I mean, obviously, there's a lot more complications there. And so the government sort of handed out export licenses like candy to companies like SMIC saying, hey, yeah, you can expand your 28 nanometer all you want, right? That's not the spirit of the regulation. Applied Materials, go ahead and ship whatever tools you want to the 28 nanometer fab in Beijing for SMIC, and then SMIC then gets those tools shipped to Shanghai, right, where they are making 14 nanometer, where they're making 7 nanometer. And this applies not only to, Applied Materials, but also applies to ASML and every other equipment company, right? So when you say, like, hey, yes, they're banned from having less than 14 nanometer on one hand. On the other hand, every single tool that they used for their 7 nanometer was the equivalent of what TSMC had when they made their 7 nanometer or an upgraded version of it, right? So it's not like any specific tools were banned that were required for 7 nanometer. And so it's kind of like, the regulation and the implementation were so far away from each other. And that's sort of what these recent regulations hopefully are going to try and help, but there's still maybe some holes there.
So actually explain this in an abstract sense. Why is it hard to align the implementation of the law with the letter of the law or the spirit of the law?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the U.S. doesn't want to wholesale ban chip production in China, period, right? While China's automotive, sort of chip manufacturing is exploding, BYD is a vertically integrated monster that is like really taking over the world with amazing vehicles and chips for those vehicles. I don't think the U.S. has really an intention to block those. But the tools that are required there, it turns out, all the advances in tools that have happened over the last, decade, many of them would still also be applied to that, say, 28 nanometer chip, just the same as it would be applied to that 7 nanometer chip. It's just the differences, throughput versus, accuracy, if you will, right, in a simplified sense. And then the other problem is this is so incredibly technical, right? Like, Doug basically told me 10 times, don't say, like a list of words that are too complicated for the audience, because it's like, the problem is the government is mostly talking to, hey, like, who's a lithography expert? Well, they all work at ASML. And what is their incentive, right? It is to ship as many tools, period, as possible, and including to China, right? Like, what does ASML care that, XYZ is happening? They want to be the monopoly in lithography and continue to ship. And if they don't ship, then, there will be a Chinese company eventually one day, right? So their incentive is for the government to have as weak of a control around lithography as possible. And they want to be like, well, hey, like, this tool's used heavily here. You can't just blanket ban it. No. Just ban it for that fab. And we promise we'll make sure that we won't ship it to that fab. But if the customer decides to move it from fab A to fab B, then, oh no.
And also, I think there's like an implication that China is going to play extremely fair with the regulations. And that's just clearly like, I feel like we keep making these regulations and they're really cute. And it's like, well, the spirit of the law and stuff. And then like, meanwhile, you look at what China is doing for their domestic semiconductor production and they're like, they don't care. Like, they do not care. And what they're doing is probably one of the most aggressive industrial policies ever to ramp their leading edge semiconductor production. Like, I think
it looks like the US in the 1930s.
Yeah,
like,
it's totally different. Like, the CHIPS Act, I'm sure everyone has like heard of and understand the CHIPS Act, right? It's like $52 billion and then plus like another 20 something in tax credits. That's peanuts. Like, we are talking a completely different game and how meaningful the incentives are there. Like, we could go on about this forever, but like essentially every step along the way has massive cost and taxes and R&D credits and rent reductions, and the big fund 1, 2, and subsequently 3 are about to launch, and all of these things together is probably putting hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to encourage the semiconductor industry to figure it out. And I think that with that much push from the top, who cares if a tool is not being used in the spirit of the law, right? Like China's government isn't going to be like, well, darn you for using this using this deposition tool for not its intended purpose. It's pretty clear that they're weaponizing the split in the East and West semiconductor supply chains, and they're trying to do it as fast as possible. And I think that that's something that the West just continues to underestimate how much gumption they have toward that.
Yeah, I remember Dan Wong, another one of our favorite Odd Lots guests, he called it China's Sputnik moment when the tech restrictions started coming into play, because like basically it was a huge wake-up call for China that it could no longer count on the US to supply its technology and that it would have to basically encourage its own domestic alternatives. So on that note, I take the point about industrial policy and the scale of the way China is doing it here. And certainly China has a lot of experience in both industrial policy and just generally a centrally planned economy. But what sense do we have of how efficient their semiconductor manufacturing process is so far? I've seen bits and pieces about this. I've seen people talk about there is a huge profit drop in SMIC earnings for the third quarter. I think something like 80%. So a lot of people are going like, yeah, okay, they're producing these new chips, the 7 nanometers, but maybe they're spending an insane amount of money to do it. And also, I think there was an inventory shortage of the phones. So maybe there's a sense that they're not able to produce these at scales just yet.
So the thing about the manufacturing here is that, their volumes are limited, right? Only about 7 million phones will ship this year, looking like they're going to ship maybe 40 million next year versus the, 1.4 billion or now 1.2 billion phones that ship a year. This is, kind of like an initial drop in the bucket, but the scale of the ramp is huge. And what's more important, I think that's hard to recognize for most people, is that semiconductor manufacturing is literally the most complex manufacturing supply chain in the world, bar none. There's more process steps, there's more complex, there's more R&D in this field than any other field. It is the most complex supply chain, period. And so when you're talking about thousands and thousands of process steps, each step has 100 different knobs that you could turn on each tool. Getting good yield, right? Getting the number of chips you try to make versus how many actually work in the end is very, very difficult. But the way you learn is by ramping, right? By producing. And then, hey, if I'm running 1,000 experiments in flight and each one has one knob slightly turned differently, and then I see, oh, which one worked? Awesome. Now I know that I leave that knob turned and now I move on to another piece, right? Sort of there's this like complex, like, constant tweaking of the process, right? This is what's made TSMC, so amazing versus, say, a company like Intel, is that TSMC, their engineers are constantly doing this even on 15-year-old process technology, still getting the yield better, still getting the performance better on, say, 90 nanometer. Whereas Intel would move on to work on the newest technology every single generation. And so SMIC, by, yes, they are not profitable, especially if you strip away the subsidies, right? The SMIC Shanghai joint venture, the subsidies they're getting from Beijing, these are massive. If you strip those out, they'd be losing billions a year, right? But that's the thing is like, hey, let's skip forward. Now, is their 28 nanometer profitable? Probably, yeah. It's their 7 nanometer that's not. Okay, but we skip forward a couple of years and it's like 7 nanometer will be very profitable. And guess what? Over 85% of the world's chip value is not under 7 nanometer today, right? And so like there is a long tail of like, hey, my car has 7 nanometer chips, right? But there are a ton of chips that are made by Texas Instruments and Analog Devices and Microchip, and you go down the list and it's like, well, China's going to compete with these companies and they're going to compete with them very strongly.
Yeah, and I think that also just looking at it in a pure, profitability perspective maybe loses some of the context of history. Taiwan, Korea did this exact same thing where you can look at the early days of TSMC and they lost a lot of money along the way. But the important thing is that by pushing their self-sufficiency, what they're going to be able to do is they're going to be able to ride up the experience curves on every single technology as they're pushing for full self-sufficiency. And I think that this story continues to evolve. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we're here to be excited to talk about it is CXMT today, actually, I think is literally today or yesterday.
Which company?
CXMT. It's their DRAM company.
Okay.
So they have a NAND company, which is YMTC, which for context is shipping the most dense memory in the world. I think that's correct, Dylan.
The most dense memory. Maybe the yields aren't great, but they've been effectively banned from tooling properly, no loopholes, and so they've been stumbling. But CXMT, company founded in 2016.
Yeah.
And they're looking to spend about $7 to $8 billion on equipment next year.
Yeah.
Which is more than Micron, by the way.
Yeah, and so they're shipping these memories that are maybe 2 to 4 years old, but this conversation, if we had this 5 years ago, it would seem insane. Truly, I think the rate of change is something that people continue to miss. And I think that as this continues, it's going to be, after they have their own domestic phone or domestic 5G modem, the domestic CPU for the phone or whatever, the NPU, then they're going to have their own domestic NAND, then they're going to have their own domestic DRAM. And then all of a sudden you just look at it and that's the entire semiconductor tool chain. So this is, and so yeah, is it capital efficient? Hell no. Big Fun 2, for example, has allegations of massive amounts of fraud, and that definitely is happening. And there's hundreds and hundreds of companies that have started probably this year to take advantage of the subsidies for semiconductors. And yes, there are lots of misses, but in terms of being able to get the talent there and then also bring them all up the learning experience, I think that that's a huge thing. And I think that's also a conversation that is completely missed about this as well, is that Dylan and I, we go to trade shows in Japan or Taiwan or Korea, and the amount of young people there versus the amount of young people in the West that are making chips is just drastically different. And I think that you fast forward that same equation, and yes, maybe they don't have EUV tools, but there are a lot of ways to make better phones using packaging or other clever engineering tricks. And so what's going to happen is that not only do they have the technological know-how, they also have the talent too. And we could be talking about in 10, 20 years that America's chip dominance is very backwards looking. And I think people need to watch this closer. The rate of change has just constantly shocked me, at least, and I'm sure Dylan, but the progress is staggering.
This kind of gets me to, I don't know if it's a strange question or a theoretical question, but when it comes to semiconductors, you hear a lot about the importance of the overall supply chain. So, people will say that NVIDIA is really good at managing its own supply chain, and that's been part of its success story. If China is now manufacturing more and more of its own chips on a domestic basis, I guess maybe it'll take them longer to develop some things, but does that in the end kind of lead to a more resilient or reliable supply chain for that technology? How do you see those two things interacting?
It depends. In capital intensive industries, what you tend to see is a very big sort of winner takes all vibe, which is why in prior, sort of technologies, if you will, right? Solar, for example, hey, Germany and the US invented all of it. And they were great until China dumped way more capital in a very capital inefficient way, put way more people at work at it, right? Smart engineers working on it. And all of a sudden, hey, 90+% of solar cells come from China. Right. And likewise, U.S. companies were the first to do electric vehicles, right? GM initially, then Tesla. But hey, China makes 3 times as many electric vehicles as the West does now. And so, sort of you see these technology curves, and there is a significant amount of winner takes all, right? If you look at Latin American markets, I mean, even Europe had to put up tariffs recently. Chinese EVs are killing it, right? The U.S. has had to put up massive tariffs and then has had the sort of the Inflation Reduction Act with the huge subsidies for battery production and cathodes and anodes and all these sorts of things. There is a big winner-takes-all sort of element of capital-intensive industries, and the semiconductor industry is not different. In fact, it is even more tilted that way. Every single vertical you look in, and there's hundreds of verticals, people think, oh, this is such a complex supply chain. Well, every single spot where you zone in, there's 2, maybe 3 competitors, right? In any specific technology, in any specific chip, and many times one. And everyone makes a good profit, and it's a very strong industry, but what happens when someone comes with breakthrough innovation and now all of a sudden, it's capital intensive and those players start to fall off or they exit markets? That's something that happens, right? And the winner does take all. And so it's not just necessarily it's a domestic supply chain. It's, hey, well, what about all of the vehicles that are being shipped out of China into LATAM, Southeast Asia, and maybe even Europe if they don't have tariffs, or the U.S. already blocks Chinese vehicles mostly, or how about solar, right? Like battery, solar inverters to convert the power from sort of the solar panels to what's acceptable for your home or for the grid. That's going to become a Chinese supply chain. Why wouldn't it, right? They already have the solar panels. So it's not just like, hey, domestic versus not. It's actually, there's a very strong element of, hey, this is going to be a Chinese supply chain, or this is going to be a Japanese supply chain, or this is going to be a Korean supply chain, which is already the case in sort of semiconductors, right? Or a US supply chain.
Yeah. And I think there's also like an important thing to note there, at least I don't think this will happen in the United States, but Europe is where this is happening the hardest. Is so we've been talking about the leading edge, which they put out this new Huawei phone, really amazing technology, but there's problems with ramping, there's problems with yield. We have some cutoffs, but China at the same time is also pressing their foot to the gas in the lagging edge. And we've been talking about automotive, and I think that's probably where it's scariest, frankly. So if you are a European automotive OEM and you are trying to sell more EVs, as everyone is, and you're buying your semiconductors from other semiconductor companies, and then you're buying the battery, and then you're putting it all together, and you're trying to have this margin, it's a single digit or maybe double digit margin. It's a very low dollar value added industry, and then you're trying to compete against BYD, and BYD in this conversation is making their own batteries. They're buying their own ships to ship the cars from China to Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, they
have their own fab.
Yeah, they have their own fab. They make all the semiconductors. Wow. And the semiconductors are, because they're becoming larger and larger parts of cars, and they are the most profitable, they are the largest gross dollar profit pool within cars.
Huh.
And so if you just do
we talk about batteries all the time, but the real profits are in the chips, huh?
Well, in batteries as well. Batteries and semiconductors. And they're doing both completely vertically integrated. So what they're going to do is they're going to collapse all that margin that the suppliers make, and then they're going to take it out of the price of the car, and they'll make the full stack margin. But if you're a European or American company competing against this, you will never compete on price. And I think that this is...
you see it with Tesla, right? Tesla has the highest gross margins in the industry. You can say what you want about their cars, right? But they have the highest gross margins, and especially after the 7th price cuts this year, they're cheap, right? And BYD is the same, except even better in many regards, and even more vertically integrated.
Yep. And it's happening a lot quicker than people realize. And I think that that's something that it's another example of where the industrial policy is just going as fast as possible with these hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies, and people are not really paying attention to the story that's happening right in front of us.
I'm glad you brought up the car chips, because it does seem as though the disruptions to car chips that we saw in 2020 is sort of what brought the semiconductor supply chain to the forefront. It's what sort of got everyone's consciousness, we can't make cars because we can't get the chips. But those aren't, the lagging edge chips. So it feels like there is this sort of incoherence that we maybe tell about the story here, where it says, okay, we need to invest in chips, but then we're talking about we need to invest in the leading edge, whereas actually the real disruption was at the lagging edge. Can you talk a little bit more what you said about how the U.S. companies gave up on the lagging edge, whereas you say if TSMC and others continue to improve their yields on the lagging edge, we don't have that here with, say, Intel?
So in some cases, right, with companies like Analog Devices, who used to vertically manufacture all their chips, they're moving more and more to having TSMC make for them. But in other cases, Texas Instruments, right, both of these companies are over $100 billion companies, but Texas Instruments, they are actually investing hugely in making more fabs and having more than 80% of their chips manufactured by themselves. And, I think, just a little bit of a chime in on the whole term lagging edge is, I think, a bit of a misnomer, because it's not like they're selling the same chip that they designed in the 1990s, right? Well, they are, but they're also selling many specialized chips that just aren't low nanometers, but they have some material innovations, or they have some different properties with them that aren't necessarily the smallest possible, but definitely specialized. And there's a humongous variety of these chips, right? So it's not like, oh, there's one chip, right? It's phone chips are quite easy to understand, and it's a single chip that it has a tens of billions of dollars market, right? AI chips, same thing, tens of billions of dollars of market, right? So we can point to that one NVIDIA chip and be like, wow, look at it. But when you look at Texas Instruments catalogs, the catalog is like so thick, it's incredible of how many different chips they sell.
It's thousands of products. It's thousands and thousands of products. And I think Texas Instruments will say this, that like half of their products have been from 1990 and earlier. So there's a lot of lagging edge chips, but the difference here is that Texas Instruments is making like a 65-70% gross margin. The business is managed extremely like a mature semiconductor company it is, but then you have the new entrants in China that are just saying, let's like completely screw up the industry structure. And that's something that's very new. MCUs, microcontroller units in China, that is like the hottest topic of disruption and what people are trying to do. And MCUs, yeah, it might be a 28 nanometer chip, or maybe it's like a 14 nanometer chip or something like that. It's not the sexiest thing, but that is that's a tens of billions of dollar market there. And I think for the reason why it's maybe not as viewed as strategically important is, let's put this in the context of AI, right? It is not a leading edge AI chip that, and the original restrictions that we put on China was to stop AI progress, right? So that's not exactly, strategically quote unquote important, but in terms of for the businesses, for economics, it's a big deal. So what they've done is they've kind of refocused on the lagging edge where they can, and they're throwing as much money into there, and is going to probably create crazy price.
Going back to this sort of idea of that, hey, this catalog is thousands of chips. This is why no one competes with each other, right? Like Texas Instruments, they're the only player in many markets, right? Or Analog Devices, and maybe the chip is only 8 cents to sell. But it maybe only costs them 2 cents to manufacture. The thing about China is they've literally psyoped their entire generation into wanting to work in semiconductors. It's literally the coolest job. There are 2 different dramas that I know of.
I was about to ask, like, are there any TV characters that are working in semiconductors? Because that's when you know.
Yeah, there's one of like this kid who's in college and he's lame, but then he like goes and works in the semiconductor industry and now he's super cool. And then there's another one where it's like a love story and they both work in a fab and they like fall in love, and it's like a drama, right? They're
like gazing at each other through the glass and stuff like that. That'd be pretty funny.
Yeah,
both wearing bunny suits.
Wait, I don't know if anyone heard, but I think the sound earlier was both Joe and I scrambling to pull up the Texas Instruments catalog.
Literally, we both. How did you know what I was typing? We just know each other that well that we both Googled Texas Instruments catalog.
But I can tell you, I'm looking at the page just for MCUs, and it looks like it's more than 1,200.
That is just one category product. Too.
Yeah.
1,238 microcontrollers and processors. Can we just order them online?
I guess you can. I mean, click the box, see what happens.
Each of those has a couple hundred pages of PDFs associated with how to design them into a product. And it's like, there's a reason no one redesigns this stuff. But now when you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming into the supply chain and like, hey, we can't order this from TXN anymore. We need to order this. We need to do this domestically. It's like, and then you also have subsidies that say, hey, if every time you design a chip of certain ages, you get pure tax credits, right?
you get just straight up a payout. Local governments, essentially each tape out will give you like $1 million.
Tape out is a design of a chip.
Yeah, a tape out all the way to design. So if you make one of these, it doesn't matter what it is, you just get money. And if you're engaged in doing anything related to a semiconductor, you have 5 years for every company, 10 years for leading edge companies, tax free. Like 200% R&D credits, meaning that like for every $10 you spend, or let's say $100 you spend in R&D, you get $220 back for certain leading edge categories. Like the subsidies here, they want you to work in it. They want to give you as much money as possible to be moderately successful. You don't even have to be that great at it, honestly. If you're just taping out bad chips, you can probably make a living doing this. Now that probably creates some pretty messed up incentives there, but the focus and the desire to get to Chinese domestic by 2030 or whatever, and that number, they're meaningfully below that, but this is a long journey, and it's pretty clear how they feel about it, right? Like this is like splitting the internet.
One of the most interesting like observations of this sort of like warped incentive structure is that the company that makes rail cars in China has made it their like national goal to like because they make profit from that, right?
Which company?
CRRC. CRRC. Yeah, so one interesting thing about this warped incentive structure is that state-owned enterprises or very successful companies that are doing really well in some market are expanding to places that make no sense, like, logically, right? Because they have profits and they're like, as Doug mentioned, right? You don't have taxes for a certain amount of time. So, hey, let me take all the profits from this business and throw them into another sector. And so CRRC is a national railway car company, and they're plowing all of their money into making their national goal to basically disrupt Infineon, which is Germany's largest chip maker, right? Who makes chips for power. Nothing sexy, right? But hey, converting from one form of power to another is a very important job for chips, and that's what Infineon's chips do, right? And this is what CRRC's sort of goal is to do that, which is nothing at all related to railway cars, but hey, I might as well do it because now if I make any money on the semiconductor business, I don't get taxed. And what I was getting taxed on my profitable, stable business is now being funneled into this new business.
This is the irony of Xi Jinping's crackdown on disorderly capital in like e-commerce and consumer tech. And now there's just like money kind of flowing indiscriminately in other sectors. Joe mentioned in the intro that it's been a while since we've done a semiconductor episode. And I think the last one that we did was actually on NVIDIA. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think that's right. And since then, the stock has absolutely exploded and there's been this frenzy over AI.
NVIDIA is just the absolute leader here. Obviously, China wants to develop its own AI models. It has its own AI models, its own large language models, its own OpenAI competitor, etc. Where is it in terms of its own access to the quality of chips that it needs to make cutting-edge AI models?
So that's probably the most effectively enforced part of the China restrictions so far, right? In 2022, now 2023, is cutting back on, hey, you can't get the chips that NVIDIA makes, has been the most successful part, basically. And NVIDIA's tried to circumvent this by, releasing new China-specific versions, and China's able to get some, but really, this is where China's ecosystem looks the most interesting for breakthrough innovation, right? Which is, hey, you guys are going in this route, which is awesome. We can't really go that route, but we have more people working on this. So why don't we try and do different things that will actually generate outcomes that are in the same vein, but not on the same path? Right. So Huawei, of course, is making chips. They're making this mobile chip on 7 nanometer, but they also have this AI chip on 7 nanometer domestically made. NVIDIA's AI chips are on 7 nanometer, so only one generation behind on process technology. But more importantly, what Huawei and SMIC are doing is that they're investing heavily in technologies that are sort of a few generations out for everyone else because they're sort of not necessary. Right. So things like bringing optical fibers directly to the AI chip. Right. So it's called co-packaged optics is the technology. Other things are called like hybrid bonding, which is like stacking chips on top of each other. They're doing really interesting things there to enable breakthrough innovation, to enable performance that is on par with the US chips like from NVIDIA or AMD, right? And they aren't there yet, but they're going to be there. And one interesting like sort of phenomenon is that like, because they can't order all these NVIDIA chips, there's really only two places in the world that will let you build data centers and have cheap power, right? East Asia can't do it because they have to import all their power. Europe hates, natural gas, and natural gas is basically how you have to power data centers. And so the US and China are really the only places that can build data centers, and China's been blocked off. So now China has like these companies flooding into Malaysia and Indonesia trying to build data centers that they can install foreign chips in, and meanwhile they're also building these chips trying to do this breakthrough innovation domestically.
Yeah, and I believe there was also a loophole that might have been priorly closed talking about how you can essentially rent a chip. So for example, a Chinese company could rent something, in AWS, you can rent a GPU that's in the cloud in, say, Singapore or something like that. But I think the conversation about hybrid bonding and co-packaged optics is really interesting, and kind of where we, at the beginning we were talking about how by cutting them off, we would effectively force them on their own roadmap. And that's kind of what's already happened. The SMIC roadmap is completely different than what is sort of the industry standard roadmap for leading edge. And as we continue to cut them off, they're going to have to kind of create a new roadmap for semiconductors going forward. And especially co-packaged optics, which is always 5 years ahead. And the reason why it's never adopted in the United States or in the Western semiconductor world is because it's just too expensive. But if you don't have an option, and this is your only option for scaling out chips, they'll pursue the expensive option. So there's going to be know-how created because of the necessity of this.
Tracy, I think when we release this episode, we should publish a glossary to and all these terms with like little like definitions. I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, have fun doing that, Joe.
Okay.
Well, actually, speaking of new terms that will no doubt need to be added to the glossary, who makes the best chips for Q-Star? That's been in the news. We don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to go ahead and ask.
Someone tried to kind of explain it to me last night, actually.
I don't even know what. My favorite take on this, and this is Dylan's take, is that Q-Star is a psyop. It's yeah.
So I'm in the Bay a lot. A lot of my friends are researchers, and we sort of have this idea that anytime OpenAI tweets about something that's related to research, they're actually just trying to psyop everyone into wasting their time on a path of ML research that is actually not not going to result in a better model. Because there's limited amounts of GPU, limited amounts of time. So if you're wasting your time doing that, instead of actually working on, what's the correct path, at least what they think, because they've done all the experiments sort of ahead of everyone else, it's easier to innovate what's already been innovated than it is to innovate something completely new. And so sort of the thought is, hey, they're doing these psyops, and Q-Star is one of those.
We'll see.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助。超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3W 点六度点 WORLD。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了，还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3W 点六度点 WORLD 尝试吧。